On this exciting episode of the Perry Pod, here comes the judge. Perry dons the judicial robes and, shocker, upholds a prosecutorial conviction. But just because there wasn't a mistrial doesn't mean the convicted party actually committed the crime. Perry's gonna have to doff those judicial robes to come to that client's aid. It's the 8th made-for-TV Perry Mason movie, The Case of the Avenging Ace. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy. My purpose here is pretty simple: provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. I plan to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and in episodes like this one, I'll take a look at some of those made-for-TV movies too. Each episode, I give a brief refresher of the plot, list some key pieces of trivia, and tackle the episode or movie's main theme. Then I feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and finish with a post-case water cooler where, just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the law library. In this trip to the law library, we talk about the appeals process, a part of the legal system we rarely see because Perry elicits a conclusive admission from each crime's guilty party. No appeals necessary. As this movie opens, Associate Justice Perry Mason hears a case as part of the Court of Appeals. He's reviewing the case of Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Parks, and the case ends with this verdict and Mason's decision about Parks's appeal.
We find the defendant, Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Parks, guilty of first-degree murder for the killing of Amy Beth Sawyer.
Appeal denied.
18 months pass and a new witness emerges that makes a retrial viable. Mason, no longer a judge, shows up at the courtroom. Both DA Michael Reston and Kevin Parks' wife, Shannon, question why Mason would side with Parks given his decision on the bench. Perry makes a fine legal distinction.
As I recall, when you sat on the appellate bench, you upheld my conviction and denied Parks' appeal.
You should also recall that I reserved comment on the merits of your case. I still do.
You were one of the judges that turned down my husband's appeal.
The court ruled that the trial was fair, nothing more. I voted with the court. But I never said I concurred with the verdict of the jury.
So that's our legal takeaway for this episode. Perry's job as a judge is not to retry the case or find the guilty party. It's merely to see if the trial was fair or not. And you can be sure it'll be plenty fair by the time Perry gets through with this one. That appeals process, after this movie, it won't be necessary. Now, let's get to the plot. The Case of the Avenging Ace. Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Parks has been found guilty of murder. The story, will you please, D.A. Reston?
Because Amy Beth Sawyer wanted to break off their illicit affair. Because Amy Beth Sawyer threatened to reveal that affair to Parks' wife. Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Parks did cruelly and viciously stab Amy Beth Sawyer to death.
Parks maintains his innocence, and a year and a half after a failed appeal, Parks gets a new day in court. Too bad his new witness, Lester McCarran, gets rattled when a mysterious man wearing a checkered shirt and a badly pasted-on beard threatens McCarran's wife. After the courtroom figuratively blows up when McCarran refused to testify on Parks' behalf, a gas container literally blows up in the elevator where Parks is being detained. The mysterious man who threatened McCarran now kidnaps Parks, murders McCarran, and leaves Parks in the desert with evidence implicating him in McCarran's death.
What we have here, Mr. Mason, is Colonel Parks' fingerprints were all over the gun used to kill McCarran. We found threads on a nail that match up with the tear in the coat Colonel Parks was wearing. You will, of course, be sent a copy of my report, but in the meantime, sir, is that tight enough for you?
At this point, we should call the episode suitable for framing. Perry, Della, and Paul Jr. want to exonerate Parks and figure out who killed Amy Beth Sawyer, the initial murder victim. Paul Jr. follows his now standard routine of chasing suspects and growing romantically close to single females who are adjacent to the case. Enter Air Force ace Captain O'Malley.
Colonel Parks is more than an officer and a gentleman. He's my friend. Earning respect as a woman in the Air Force isn't always a smooth course, Mr. Drake. Colonel Parks helped me over some of the rough spots.
And you don't think he's guilty either?
Judging by the man, no. Illicit affairs, murder, not Colonel Parks.
Plus, we get this music. And then there's Lieutenant Wilkins, the secret lover of Amy Beth Sawyer, and the real reason that Kevin Parks was connected with Amy. You see, Wilkins has an ear issue that was threatening his career as an Air Force pilot, and only Parks could help. The supposed affair between Sawyer and Parks was just a setup. But who did the setting up? As for our suspects, let's see. There's Amy Beth Sawyer's creepy employer, Jason Sloan.
Mr. Sloan, if Miss Sawyer had told Colonel Parks about that report, you would have been ruined. You had motive, means, opportunity.
There's Jason's wife, Althea Sloan, played by Patty Duke. I smell a Della trivia section candidate.
Isn't it true that to protect what remained of the Milbourne legacy, you arranged to have Amy Beth Sawyer murdered and Colonel Parks framed for that murder?
No, that is not true.
That would be Ellis Milbourne, Althea Sloan's brother. Oh, we got serious funny business going down with the whole Sloan land business that Althea, Ellis, and Jason are working on. Let's get this case's Salty Sims memorial witness to tell the tale.
Says here Milburn's old land is safe to build on.
And you believe the land is not safe?
Of course it isn't. Old Milburn had a big chemical factory out there dumped straight into the ground. Land's toxic as a witch's wash. You can't build on that land. Not now, not ever.
The man whose voice you just heard is named Chester. Chester Lackberry. That's an all-time name right there. Meanwhile, Paul is chasing the mysterious mountain man through the most 1988-ish mall you can imagine. The mountain man was none other than Ellis Milbourne in disguise. Althea Sloan told me she was feeling guilty of having committed a little murder.
It was our way out. Ellis blamed Jason and he blamed me, so I went along with it. It was Ellis's idea.
Your Honor, defense moves to drop all charges against this defendant. I will at the appropriate time move to set aside the conviction in the other case and exonerate this defendant fully.
Go listen to the song Althea if you're not familiar with that one. It's a classic. My Perry remix version doesn't quite do it justice. Lieutenant Colonel Parks gets his life back. Paul Jr. is flying high with Captain Terry O'Malley, even though they're driving back to wherever Paul lives. And Perry and Della, well, they're aces. No vengeance necessary. Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. A Della is something about a particular actor in the story. or actress. Perry is something we learn about our main character. Our Paul for this episode concerns the inner ear condition afflicting Lieutenant Wilkins, recurrent vestibular neuronitis.
In layman's terms, an inner ear problem that causes extreme dizziness, a condition that could end a pilot's career.
Now, our man claims he's been taking meclizine to counter this inner ear problem. So our Paul prompt: could an Air Force pilot make it to the level of lieutenant by covering said problem with meclizine? Is meclizine even a standard inner ear problem drug? Get your pharmaceutical sleuthing on and let me know what you find. Our Della for this episode concerns Patty Duke, aka Althea Sloan.
My father had worked so hard. He'd left us so much.
10 facts about Patty Duke. And no, one of them wouldn't be a hot dog makes her lose control. Thank you very much. Number 1, born in 1946 in Queens. Birth name Anna Marie Duke. Her father, an alcoholic cabbie who left the family at age 6. Number 2, her showbiz life controlled from a young age by John and Ethel Ross, who were initially the agents for Anna's older brother. It was the Rosses who changed Anna's stage name to Patty. Number 3, Patty's big break was on Broadway in the role of Helen Keller in The Miracle Worker. She portrayed Helen Keller opposite Anne Bancroft, who was Annie Sullivan, and Duke won rave reviews. She even won an Oscar in 1962 for the same role when she reprised it for the big screen. Number 4, after the success of The Miracle Worker came the sitcom The Patty Duke Show, built on the premise that Patty Lane, a teen played by Duke, had an identical Scottish cousin named Kathy, also played by Duke. The Miracle Worker, this wasn't, but the show made Duke famous, and Duke apparently hated it. Number 5, the Rosses were serious trouble. According to Duke, they each abused her. They introduced her to alcohol and drugs. They took her money, nearly $1 million. As close as we can figure, they controlled her career. They took her away from her actual family. And random factoid here, Duke appeared on the $64,000 challenge in 1959 and got fed answers in order to win $32,000, of which the Rosses took 15%. How do we know this? Mr. Ross himself testified to the shenanigans before Congress in 1959. Number 6, Patty's first 2 marriages were short-lived. The first happened when she was a teenager and featured the assistant director from The Patty Duke Show. The second one lasted all of 13 days. The third one, to actor John Astin, lasted from 1972 to 1985, and Sean Astin of The Lord of the Rings and Rudy fame was one of their children. Number 7, Duke won 3 TV Emmys. The third for a 1979 adaptation for TV of The Miracle Worker, where she played Annie Sullivan to Melissa Gilbert's Helen Keller. I would love it if there were a story where she tried to be Helen Keller grown up, but that's not what happened. They just made her Annie Sullivan and gave the Helen Keller part to Melissa Gilbert. Number 8, Duke battled mental health issues throughout her life and attempted suicide several times in the 1970s and early 1980s until in 1982 she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Number 9, she married an Army drill sergeant named Michael Pierce in 1986 and remained wedded to him until her 2016 death. Number 10, she died at the age of 69 from a ruptured intestine. So if you're keeping track, the first 3 marriages, multiple Emmys, an Oscar win, suicide attempts, all happened before Patty Duke was 40. She was only 41 when she appeared on Perry Mason, playing a woman zealous to preserve her father's legacy. Whew. Our Perry for this episode involves what are frankly the best parts of these TV movies, these little asides the writers keep giving us between Perry and Della. I'll just drop two of them in here as something we learn about our intrepid hero. After a courtroom adjournment, we get this exchange between Perry and Della.
I'll take these. You find that engineer.
Yes, sir.
You forgot to salute.
Classic military humor from our man. And then, as the episode is ending, we learn about Perry's predilections for certain kinds of transportation.
That's not a bad idea. Taking a long, leisurely drive home. I'll even drive if you will trust me not to get lost.
I have a better idea.
You mean you would take the train?
No, I want it.
You what?
I'll leave it up to you to try to figure out what Perry's telling Della in the midst of all that jet engine noise. Our theme for this episode, family bonds. The real scandal about the Lieutenant Colonel Parks case, the fact that he betrayed his wife. One sign he was innocent, his wife stood by him the entire time. And of course, Parks really had been true to his wife. He had not been having an affair with Amy Beth Sawyer. Potential blockbuster witness Lester McCarran, remember, abandons his testimony when his wife's safety is threatened. And then if we want negative examples, oh goodness, the Sloans, Jason Sloan, sleazebag, Althea, dedicated to trying to keep her father's legacy alive, but she's got to rely on her brother to help her, and she's trying to cover over the fact that she's married a sleazebag. Cautionary tales all. And of course they're the villains. They don't respect family bonds. And finally, we get two devoted metaphorical families, the proud men and women of the United States Air Force, and Della, Perry, and Paul Jr. Captain O'Malley remains true to Lieutenant Colonel Parks and helps her superior officer in his time of need. Della and Paul Jr. come through for Perry. No need for family-applied vengeance here. You just need to stay true, and they do. Now, let's get to our Perry proverb. Early in the movie, Perry meets D.A. Michael Reston outside the courtroom. Reston admonishes Perry to not get his hopes too high for Kevin Parks getting off this time. It inspires this instant Perry proverb classic.
I wouldn't be too positive, Mr. Mason, with or without a new witness.
I am never too positive, Mr. Reston.
The meaning? Perry's never as sure of himself as Reston is. That's why he wins all of his cases, and Reston's pulling losses all the time. Check the Justice Wins column, Reston. Better to be skeptical on the front end and find the truth than blindly certain you've got the murderer when you don't. Physician, heal thyself? Well, more like lawyer, defend thyself. Now, let's grab a swig from the water cooler.
You know, there is one thing I don't understand. Go on, Paul.
Each episode in the water cooler, we give you deleted scenes where we imagine the scenes that didn't make the movie's final cut. Number one, we've got Paul and Captain O'Malley surviving a series of crashes in increasingly ridiculous vehicles. There's a clown car, there's a bicycle built for two, there's a Formula One race car, and eventually it ends with them crashing a space shuttle. Paul Jr. is trouble. That's what I'm trying to say. Number two, we get the dramatic scene where Lieutenant Colonel Parks shaves that sweet mustache in shame after his initial appeal is denied. Number three, we get a scene where Paul returns to the shopping mall and just tries to find Captain O'Malley a gift. It's just 30 minutes of Muzak and Paul spritzing perfume on his hands and wondering if he's buying Captain O'Malley clothes that are the right size at the Gap before he settles on getting her the latest Debbie Gibson LP from Camelot Music. Number four, There's just clips of Perry in a montage trying to stay awake after eating a heavy lunch and sitting through endless judicial appeals. Number 5, we get Paul Jr. describing the checker-shirted man to a police sketch artist for at least 30 minutes, and they get caught up on the description of the Abe Lincoln beard the guy is sporting. Number 6, could we get one more scene with Chester Lackberry, please? Maybe a montage of various projects that Lackberry has put the kibosh on? And then finally, number 7, Perry keeps trying to tell Della important things while airplanes keep flying over the pair and drowning out Perry's vital words. If you've got ideas for deleted scenes from the movie, send them on, please. Our Paul from the case of the scandalous scoundrel concerned the gossip pieces from the confidential informer. We asked, did any of the pieces mentioned in the movie mirror real news pieces?
I've sent you at least 5 on that chain of nursing homes.
You get me what I want, and I'll give you what you want.
Loyal listener Tim Cree did some digging. He reports, quote, in 1987, an orderly at a nursing home assaulted a patient, quote, and the owner was charged as an accessory for trying to impede the police investigation. However, from what Tim found, this was an isolated incident. A study from 1980 showed that nursing home malfeasance was basically non-existent in Colorado. So it doesn't look like the whole nursing home scandal from the case of the scandalous scoundrel was in any way related to reality. 2 other messages we got that were worth passing on. My Aunt Myra reminded me that Ted Bundy and Gary Hart were 2 Colorado-connected men who appeared frequently in the news in the 1980s, though analogs for their specific stories didn't end up in the pages of the confidential informer. And then listener Pat wrote in to support the podcast and remind me about the fact that Audible has available radio dramas by the Colonial Theater Company, which dramatize many of the early Mason novels. Check one out and see what you think. I've listened to The Case of the Velvet Claws and The Case of the Curious Bride. They're fine. They don't outshine the novels, but they were enjoyable. As always, I love feedback about this particular episode of the podcast in general. Was there something about this episode you'd like to comment on or something you'd like to correct? You can email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. All PerryPod episodes are available via Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes. Join me next time, won't you, as we review the last film with Paul Drake Jr. and D.A. Michael Reston. It's The Case of the Lady of the Lake. Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat.